reading YouTube. Today we're going to be looking at Black and White, The Life of Sammy Davis Jr. by Will Haygood, forward by Denzel Washington. Now, I haven't had a lot of luck with biographies in the past year or so. Steve McQueen's biography was depressing. I couldn't finish Dean Martin's. And I was just like, wow, I don't know if I want to read another book about someone I have very fond memories of my childhood. Will I just be equally disappointed? But since there was a foreword by Denzel Washington, an actor I respect, and a guy who seems to only attach himself to some projects he actually has some connection to or feelings for. He doesn't seem to be the guy that just does anything. And he's also a person who doesn't do sequels, which could be considered at least he's being critical and discerning in his film choices. So I thought, okay, I'll give it a shot. Also, I found this at a thrift store remainders section, a by the pound section of Goodwill. So I essentially paid 30 cents for this book. It's a big book. And I was surprised that it went there. Maybe because the cover's got some turned corners. I think that may be the reason they saw this. Like, no one will buy this. But it's a good book, and it also happens to be autographed by the author. So I actually don't know what I'm going to do with this book, because I don't know if I just want to. I could just donate it again, but I'm very afraid they'll give it away to someone that, or they'll just put it back in the remainder section, because it really needs to be read. It shouldn't just be tossed aside. And someone out there may really appreciate getting an autographed copy of this book. And the back is the Will Haygood, a staff writer for the Washington Post, is also the author of Two on the River, King of the Cats, The Life and Times of Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., and The Haywoods of Columbus, a family memoir. And I may actually look up his other pieces of writing, because he is quite talented. Now, my memories of Sammy Davis Jr. are from when I was younger. In fact, the last thing I saw him in, as far as actual entertainment that I consumed when it was produced, was probably Cannonball Run, and his involvement in that was somewhat limited. I think he was on the set for a total of 3 days or something like that. And he was very much just kind of playing up the character of Sammy Davis Jr. as opposed to the man himself. So I knew that my view of the man was skewed just from his television appearances and his music and things like that, and the myth and the legend around the man was more of what I had in my head than the actual man. So I think, okay, since I actually don't know a lot about the guy, I'll read the biography in hopes to learn something about him. And this was a weighty tome. It's a big book. It's on the upper limit of the books I read, because I read them at work. So I actually have to be able to hold these things in one hand while I'm eating. So there are limitations to the size of the books I can read, and it just was pushing in the envelope. And it's also weighty because, as much as I enjoyed the book, and I did enjoy the book from beginning to end, there's a whole lot of Sammy Davis Jr. to consume in one go. And near the end of the book, it became a bit of a slog for me. It could have just been that, the other things in my life were changing my way of looking at the book as I went. Who knows? Maybe if I'd be able to read it a little more consistently from beginning to end, it might have been differently. Because I only read this at breaks and beginning before work and things like that. But the story is told in a manner that lets you rest with each of the people in Sammy Davis Jr.'s life for long enough to have a feeling for who they are before we go on to the next person. And he goes all the way back to his grandmother, and he talks about the people that were born in the 19th century and how they contributed to who Sammy Davis Jr. became, the good and the bad. Because the people in this are three-dimensional, and they are a mixture, just like us, of good and bad. We've all done things that were problematic, or we've all done things that maybe if we'd had a chance to see things as they might have shaken out in the future, we may not have done. And his grandmother, for example, was Cuban. It was black. But because she was a lighter-skinned black person, considered herself superior, and so thought of herself as Cuban and not black. and looked down upon, was racist towards dark-skinned black people, which was a tactic used by the Spanish in Cuba to get the light-skinned black people and the dark-skinned black people at loggerheads with each other, so they weren't joining forces and looking to the Spanish nobility that were running the country and say, okay, why are you exploiting us? So she was an unrepentant racist her whole life, referring to black people in the kindest moments as pickaninnies. Sammy Davis Jr. was raised from age 4 onward as a vaudevillian. Think about that. He was on stage at 4 years old, and he never really stopped being a performer until the latter stages of throat cancer at the end of his life. And he wasn't all that old. He died in 1990. He was born in 1925, so he wasn't all that old. His mother wanted to be a famous singer and Broadway hit. She wasn't. His father was a vaudevillian with Will Maston, and the Will Maston trio, which ended up being Sammy Sr., Sammy Jr., and Will Maston, became a team that functioned up through the 1950s all the way to 1960. And Sammy Davis Jr. had a horrible time escaping from it. But he was raised on the road, and he essentially didn't see his mother, and his mother essentially wanted nothing to do with him. It wasn't just that his father picked him up and took him away. It was really much a whole lot about she'd been on the road herself and was letting family members raise her own children. And in fact, at one point, she had left Sammy as like a 3-year-old with some people to foster him, and then his other grandmother rescued him from unhealthy living conditions, and then when her son finally took him away to go on the road with him because the father wanted to have some bonding with his son, so at least the father tried in some ways to bond with Sammy. It broke his grandmother's heart. Thankfully, they were able to stay close for her entire life, as best as they could, being on the road. And they were on the road constantly. He was raised on the road. He didn't know what it was to have a home until he was an adult. Like, he was like 29 before he actually had a place to call his own. That's what warps a person. That changes their way of looking at the world. And he was always looking for the approval of absent parents, in the sense that his father didn't give him roots, in the sense that his mother wasn't there. She didn't even mention the fact she had a son. There are people that knew this woman that didn't know she had a son because she just never mentioned it. So these people were good and they were bad, and they had all of their foibles that we all have. He became a spendthrift because he had so little when he was growing up, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. And when he died, he left huge debts behind. The people in his life lost, his wife at the time lost the home they had. He just left tax debts. He didn't have a sense of place, a sense of I'm here. I have a center. And that's the problem of his whole life. He never had a center. But he was quite possibly the greatest living entertainer that there ever was. He could sing, he could dance, he could do impressions, he could do jokes, he could act. He was an expert with 6-shooters. Strange as that seems, he perfected his skill with 6-shooters. And he did all of this even after losing an eye in a car accident. He was a genius at entertainment. High energy, absolute, 100%, all the way, balls to the wall, all the time. Fueled by alcohol, sometimes by drugs, other than alcohol. He smoked, and it is the alcoholism and the smoking that eventually killed him. It ruined his liver, it ruined his lungs and his throat. It killed him. He could have lived, heck, he could still be alive today. My wife's grandmother is alive today, and she was born 11 years before Sammy Davis Jr. So he could still be alive today if he'd had better habits, and if he'd had a better stable life, and maybe had taught him the value of having better habits. He was horrible when it came to being loyal to the women in his life. He slept with hundreds, maybe thousands of women over the course of his life. He pursued white women as a fetish, and it wasn't healthy. He didn't even begin to address his own blackness until he was 40. Running away from being black for 40 years. Trying to be white. Desperately trying to not be black. Wanting all the things that the white actors and singers. He wanted to be Frank Sinatra. And he lived in Frank Sinatra's shadow for decades. And there's a difference between falling in love with someone or even lusting after someone and they happen to be a particular ethnicity and chasing someone because they're of that ethnicity. One is just love or lust. The other is a fetish. And that isn't happy when your fetish involves another human being. And he fetishized white women in a very unhealthy way. He was involved with the mafia in a very unhealthy way. To the point where they threatened his life because they felt he was crossing too many gender roles, rather too many racial roles. He was pushing the envelope. Too much black-white going on in a time when that wasn't allowed. He couldn't rent his first apartment at 29 because he was black. His white publicist had to do it for him under his name. This book gives you a slice into American racism from the point of view of entertainers that I'd never seen. It was very informative. It was very interesting. I really enjoyed the book. I come away still having a great deal of respect for Sammy Davis Jr. and accepting now that he was a very much flesh and blood person. He always wanted to entertain because he was always looking for the approval of others. Which is wonderful for us and sad for him. I wish I could have hugged him and said it's okay just to be you. But that's a hard lesson for some of us to learn. And he was one of them. So, if you are a fan of Sammy Davis Jr., read the book. If you are a fan of that era of the famous Brat Pack, of Vegas and Hollywood and the transition from vaudeville to more conventional contemporary forms of entertainment. If you want to know what the world was like for black entertainers from the 19th century up through the ends of the 21st, this is an important book. And Denzel Washington was important to do the introduction and to bring this book to the attention of us, because it's a great book. He'll always still be the person in my head that sings Candyman and Bojangles, who can twirl a six-gun in a way that you wouldn't believe, who trained Steve McQueen to use a six-gun, who could do impressions rapid fire, and whose feet could move fast as lightning.